Hello guys, and welcome back to another video where today we are going to finish up Keep the Home Fires Burning, a story by my dad. It's a really great story and I'm going to read the rest of it to you guys today. I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little bit funny. I just got finished reading some no sleep stuff and that voice is a little bit difficult on my throat, so it hurts a little bit, but I gotta get this recorded and then another one recorded right after I write the script. But for now, welcome back to Keep the Home Fires Burning. Hopefully we will finish the rest of it today. It was in mid-December when next I saw the old house. Dad and I went out to go hunting a couple of weeks before Christmas, partially to hunt and also with the hope of stirring Grandfather from the dreadful melancholy which enveloped him. As we drove in from the road that Friday evening, the light of the setting winter sun shone through beneath the overhanging clouds and seemed to place the house in a spotlight. The long slope of the hill up to its kitchen side was lit by the dying gleam, and the western window of the kitchen glistened, reflecting the escaping sun. The kitchen itself lay upon the flattened hill, with the body of the house rising above it, and the bedrooms, added to the rear on the eastern end, seemed to dwindle into the shadow behind. I had never before been struck by the vaguely bestial appearance of the house before, and the thought brought instant memories of a month before, unbidden to my mind. Our arrival was cheerfully greeted by both Aunt Kalia and Uncle Frank. Frank was a surprise to everyone, as he had been scheduled out of town until the following week, but a breakdown on the job had sent him home for the weekend. The evening was spent with an air of good humor and togetherness that had not existed during the past year, and even Grandfather's moody spirit seemed to lighten. David and Joseph and I renewed squabbles and agreements with the general equanimity of youngsters who have known and been close with one another for a lifetime, while Kay interjected herself into our discussions as often and loudly as possible. Frankie was always with friends on a hunting trip of his own, but Uncle Frank and my father animatedly and closely discussed the paths of their lives, including tales of Aunt Kalia's childhood, resemblance to Kay's actions, and the upcoming hunt in the way of those old enough to laugh about the exuberant nature of youth. Having spent a long evening in what was surprising familiar fellowship, the adults sought the beds, and we kids spent the night camped here and there about the place, as we had done so many times through our lives before. At some point in the dark of night, or likely early morning, I came suddenly awake without actually knowing why. David, bedded on the floor close by in his own blankets, also lay in sudden wakefulness, and both of us listened for what might have interrupted our exhausted slumber. After a few moments, the floor gave a low, creaking groan. Out of the darkness, David whispered to me. "It does that a lot. Pop says it's the foundation settling. Most of the doors don't close too good anymore, and he says we'll need to do something about it in the summer." We lay quietly in the darkness for some time, listening to the occasional creaks and settlings of the old house until we drifted back into our disturbed sleep. Morning came before daylight for hunters, and our repose was broken next by Dad pulling us from our blankets. Coffee was gulped and cereal was swallowed. The fact that Grandmother always had breakfast ready before we left struck me, and the other two boys and I left with Uncle Frank and my dad for the wooded land behind the neighbor's pasture. My grandfather, who was up and almost himself as he drank coffee with the boys, as he called the older two of our group, sighed as we left and returned to his corner to brood rather than accompany us. The walk through the crisp pre-dawn darkness was accomplished in silence, and we reached the end of the heavy band of dry broom sedge separating the clipped grass of my grandparents', Aunt Kalia's, yard from the fence of the Woodsons' east pasture. At the fence border, 2, perhaps 3 rabbits seemed to explode beneath our feet, running uncharacteristically into the more open ground of the pasture. As the rabbits raced out of sight in the darkness of the pasture, Dad remained that it was a shame we weren't after cottontails, and Uncle Frank exclaimed his temptation to try with his rifle. But we turned left and proceeded down the edge of the fence to the woods behind. Soon ensconced on stands, all of us forgot the rabbit incident while enduring the exciting tedium of watching trails for the ghost-like appearance of deer. The wait endured for quite some time, which was marked by the growing twitter of birds, chattering of squirrels, and the gradual lightening of the sky. Well after the sun put on his dim appearance behind the wreck of clouds which blanketed the sky, a rifle shot cracked the air like a sharp thunder. The first was followed almost immediately by a second, and then silence again encapsulated the woods. Giving some time for things to settle and for anything else, startled by the gunfire, to wander past my own position was a necessity, but I soon alighted my own post and went in search of our lucky hunter. It has, as it turned out, been Joseph, and I found both him and his dad working on a decent little 4-point buck in a clearing west of my stand. David and my father soon drifted in, and, as was our habit, we all shared in hauling the carcass back to the house for skinning and butchering. With practiced hands, this was accomplished readily and quickly enough that an old one shed behind the kitchen, in front of which hung a single tree, and inside which was a stainless steel cutting table. By shortly afternoon, Joseph's kale was packaged in the freezer, aside from the tenderloins, which were sliced fresh and sizzling in grandmother's old cast iron. Aunt Callia, up by now, at least the thought came unbidden to mind, baked fresh biscuits, which would have rivaled my grandmother's, and, in the tradition of hunters everywhere, we embellished the story of the morning outing as we ate the best of country meals. It was certain, for my attentive friend, better times, almost like old times. Even David and I enjoyed that meeting as much as we had any others at the old farm, but even our fathers remarked on how the blood from the deer seemed to disappear into the ground. We left there, my father and I, in a cheerful mood, and returned to our home in town. We celebrated Christmas that year with my mother's family, and had a holiday which mocked with its cheer all the disturbances of our previous year, but I dreamed on our last night in Grandma and Grandpa's house that the blood disappearing into that cold, packed earth. Perhaps by now you might realize how my gradual observation of this impossible phenomenon was not without success in its surreal nature. It took on rather an ebb and flow, somewhat akin to the respiration which sustains us all. The impossibility of its final conclusion, which becomes more readily acceptable as one contemplates the unnatural being's participation in natural existence. Of course, as we slowly accept this reality, our sense of what may be real and true twists about in a rather disconcerting way. Perhaps it was my cousin who first perceived this, so please bear with me, my friend. Hear me out, I beg, because none of those who sit with me here attempt any understanding of my discomfort. April showers perhaps bring Mayflowers in some parts of our great earth, but in the area of the farm, mid-May is the time when the brief spring is giving way to the parched, oppressive heat of the southern summer. It was during this time of year that Uncle Frank managed to get a company and come look at the groaning, creaking foundation of the house. Through much measuring, door swinging, and crawling, they determined that yes, the old place was settled and unlevel, and that they could, of course, correct the problem. It was early June, I think, when they arrived to actually begin work, which would consist of raising the settled portions of the house with an amazingly complicated set of interconnected jacks, all working from a control center on a truck out front. My dad was curious and excited about the operation, so we went out the evening following the completion of their setup just to see the system. It was deep twilight upon our arrival, but Dad looked as much as he could at the hoses and controls, trying to divine their specific actions and purposes, all the while lamenting that he could not watch the next day's lifting. I couldn't really find much pleasure in mechanical examinations, but David filled me in on the excitement of people crawling about beneath the place all day as we strolled about in the gradually cooling evening. Our steps led us inevitably to the western end of the house and the slope beyond the kitchen. As we gazed briefly into the dying light of the sunset, it struck me that I heard no crickets, no frogs, no sound of the nature's life about us. As this realization dawned, I turned to see David watching me curiously, and could see the relief cross his features as he noticed my look. "You hear it too," he whispered. "It's like this every night. It's like nothing is living here anymore." We turned almost together to gaze back up at the slope of the kitchen and the row of posts, which seemed far more prominent than ever before. We didn't look very long, but we made our way back around front. I couldn't help but notice a gap, a dark space between the kitchen wall at the bottom and the basement supports. It was close to the center, and it made me shiver a bit to see, right above the post upon which Vincent met his horrifying end. Here I must apologize, my patient friend, because I did not bear actual witness to the events of the following day. Having returned to our home in town that night with my father, having heard the tale as related to my father by Aunt Callia, as well as the tearful report supplied by David, and having witnessed the aftermath myself, I feel confident in passing my hearsay along to you, though I shall attempt the relation of a composite narrative, for its bearing on the overall series of events is undeniable. The work crew arrived in the fairly early portion of the morning, and proceeded to make final preparations for the leveling. My aunt and the kids, though not asked to do so by the men involved, decided to vacate the house itself during the lifting and wait outside, where they could both play and watch the operations. Running engines and machinery were sufficient to engage the attention of all three boys for a while, and Kay, having been admonished not to be in the work area, went off to play on her own. Some 30 minutes later, while lifting operations slowly, becoming a bit boring to the observers, in motion, a high-pitched scream was heard from the kitchen end of the house. All three boys ran immediately around to find Kay inside the gap that I had noticed the night before, sticking out from the waist up, screaming to deafen a banshee. They ran to her as Aunt Callia made it around the wall, and truly only her confirmation of my cousin's report could have induced me, at least at that time, to embrace it as truth. The kitchen, as they all tell me, seemed to rise off the foundation, widening the gap between the cellar boards and the kitchen beam, then settle again with a suddenness which blew a dusty exhalation down the hill. In this motion the boys, holding tightly to their sister's arms, felt her pulled from them, and she disappeared into the darkness below the kitchen. Work had, quite naturally, halted during this disaster, and it was likely the men of the crew, according to my aunt, who salvaged her grip on sanity at that moment. Two reminded her of the cellar's existence itself, and the others moved swiftly into the kitchen, making their way to the door in the back. This door they found open, and below they heard loud but incomprehensible sounds. As they moved on to the dark stairs beyond the door, they found my grandfather pulling himself and Kay up the steps, the girl on his shoulder and working his free hand to move. The crewman relieved grandfather of his burden and pulled him up the stairs as well. Callia and the boys came to see him collapse unconscious on the kitchen floor as he came up, and to notice Kay's condition as she lay, barely breathing, in the arms of one of the workmen. Her left leg was missing just above the knee, and her thigh was tightly bound by the suspenders which were constantly draped over my grandfather's shoulder. Someone had, amidst the excitement, already called an ambulance, and soon it bore both Kay and grandfather to the hospital in town. Aunt Callia called my mother, since we lived nearby, and we both met them at the hospital. So here again, my friend, I can narrate to you my own observances. Kay herself had almost bled out prior to her arrival, saved only by grandfather's tourniquet and the best efforts of the medical personnel aboard the ambulance. Grandfather himself was believed to have suffered a heart attack as a result of the excitement and exertion, and upon our arrival at the hospital, both of them were secured behind the sterile doors of the ICU. It was in that silent waiting room that David, looking as though the world was ending, first whisperingly related to me the events which I have above described. During the course of that evening, most of the tale was almost precisely confirmed by both Frankie and Joseph, and when he arrived from work, Aunt Callia bawled the same story on my father's shoulder, including the fact that Kay's leg could not be found, although the workmen searched the basement for it. Only at a later time would any of us remember that it was June 7th. Had she still been with us, it would have been grandmother's birthday. It was, I suppose, understandable that no one wished to return that night to the farm. The three boys pitched camp in our house that night, and Aunt Callia could in no way be coerced from the confines of the waiting room at intensive care. My mother stayed with her until Uncle Frank arrived from his job out of town in the dark early morning, while my father did his best to calm the shock of my three cousins and get us to rest. Rest was far from all of us, I think, and David and I sat alone together in my room, discussing openly, for the first time, all of these interrelated events, convinced at last that greater powers were moving than we understood. Although our ignorance prevented us from forming any coherent plan, we resolved nonetheless that we must, in some fashion, bring an end to this matter. Are you convinced of this yet, my most thoughtful friend? I see clearly that you are not. Comfort and distance breed skepticism and make it easy for the impossible to remain so within your acceptance. In that time and place, however, there was no comfort, and no distance seemed sufficient from the growing horror devouring the happiness of my childhood and family. Our final doubts were exercised in the light of the day, when David and I were allowed to see grandfather the following morning. He lay in the unit bed, pale but alert, watching as we walked in and greeting us both softly. My mother had accompanied us into the ward, but he asked her to leave us with him as soon as he saw him awake, and she complied, warning us that we only had a few minutes. "You two know something, don't you?" he asked as Mother's footsteps retreated. We stood there without speaking, but he simply nodded, and slowly, and the next few words he spoke are, and shall remain forever etched across my soul in ice. "Boys, there's something real bad in the ground at the house. Your grandma knew it as we moved in, but something in her spoke to it. She understood it, kept it happy, and I knew when she passed on, particularly as she did, that something would happen. Never knew it'd be this bad." He lay back then and closed his eyes, breathing deeply, but he raised his head up suddenly with his eyes wide and bright. "You gotta get folks clear of the place. I told Callia this morning, but she thinks I'm just a rambling old man. You don't blame her, I guess." The nurse came in then and ushered us out, telling him that he was getting overexcited. We returned to the waiting room where the others were discussing Kay, and no one asked us about grandfather or why he sent Mom away. Kay was moved to her room that day. It is good to know that, isn't it, my friend? It was good for all of us, and other cousins and aunts and uncles all found the measure of thankfulness that be had in the news. With the knowledge that she would eventually be better, at least, came the acceptance that life must regain some level of sane reality, and my father and uncle rode together to the farm that afternoon. David and I went along, convinced by grandfather's words that whatever lay there must be stopped in some fashion, though we had no idea how. We had together searched my library caverns again during the free portion of the day, and aside from the vague idea that an Otchi Monitu, which was a bad spirit among many native tribes, we had no idea what the thing believed in the farm may be. June days are long in southern climes, and having left town as early as possible, we arrived with perhaps an hour before the dark and falling sun setting fire to the wispy clouds lightly covering the western sky. The work crew had left things as they were, perhaps thinking of a possible investigation, and as we arrived, the hoses of machinery brought my mind back to grandfather, similarly enwrapped within his hospital bed. The image which it presented was a disturbing one in the context of the frightening events, and I feel that everyone in the car felt some level of discomfort it raised. Picture in your mind my most deeply appreciated confidant, the western kitchen window ablaze, and the sloping head of the kitchen leaning to the broad back of the main house, which itself cast deep shadow over the trailing bedroom behind. All of this connected by a bewildering series of lines to a great machine in the front, which seems set to infuse life into the slumping beast. Your skepticism tells you that I am seeing all of this filtered through the eyes and overwrought mind of a youth, and you are right. If you have heard my tale to now, please, I beg you, listen to its conclusion and cast rationality upon the destruction of my innocent belief in objective reason. All of us, my father, Uncle Frank, David, and I, entered the house through the main door, avoiding the kitchen without thought, although its entrance had for my lifetime been the way into the house. Cracks ran through the walls, and doors sat visibly askew within twisted frames. Windows were warped and many cracked, one shattered pane. The window, though, which grandfather had once viewed his beloved garden, lay scattered on the floor, twinkling like crystal gems in the reflected firelight of the setting sun. We stalked grimly through fallen pictures and tumbled furniture, the cast-off and broken remains of 2 generations of life, taking silent toll of the damage. It was Uncle Frank who reached for the mantel above the stone fireplace in the center of the central room and lifted a picture which lay there, face down in its frame amid the fragments of glass which had long protected it. The photo was of my grandmother, an old picture of my grandmother, which had rested upon that mantel throughout the entirety of my short life. He blew fragments from its face and set it gently upright on the mantel again. The house breathed. The instant that the picture touched the mantel, a swelling sigh seemed to push the walls of the house outward and simultaneously encapsulate those of us inside in a soft cushion of pressured air. A fragment of a second, which took a lifetime to pass, later a deep huffing blew dusty ash from the old fireplace across Uncle Frank's legs and shoes, and my uncle screamed loud enough to raise the resonance of the cemetery a mile away. That huffing exhalation was hot as a breath of wind from the depths of the volcano. The ashes flowing across Frank's legs burned him like a torch, covering his lower limbs like a tiny pyroclastic flow, and melting flesh and clothing into an unrecognizable blend of flaming horror. The floor around him was burning, and in the same instant he was falling, still screaming, into those flames and out of sight. Even as the second puffing and inhalation began, my father was pulling David and me, throwing us toward the door and screaming himself, perhaps in words, but my memory holds no comprehension of them as if they were there. David and I hit hard on the stone porch and rolled as an explosion of flame propelled my dad through the door halfway across the yard, where he fetched up smoking against the foundation machinery. Without looking around, I ripped myself free of the roses beside the porch and staggered toward my father, beholding as I did so the final impossible horror which awaited me. As the sunset lit the western sky, the kitchen rose up and turned with ponderous speed towards us. It no longer resembled a house or the fiery testament to my grandfather's skill at feeding her family. It was rather a great bestial head, the massive lower teeth of which seemed just like the posts of the old cellar wall, only pointed and gleaming as hot. Smoky breath flowed around them, flames leapt from those powerful jaws, and I fell backward, feeling the flesh of my hands and arms burning as the fire passed to my right, engulfing the machinery and my father. I rolled and ran, just ran. I never looked back, and I never knew the ending of my cousin, who I so shamefully left behind. I ran and I screamed until my voice broke and I collapsed completely, still attempting to run while prostrate upon the earth. It was Miss Woodson who found me, kicking feebly with my mouth open in a scream of total silence. I wound up here through some process which I can't recall, but those moments when the old house reared up remain clearer than any theater screen can boast. Never, never will that horrible recollection fade from my sight. I put it together as I gradually came back to myself. I related to you earlier that I was bookish and that I saw explanations for these experiences. I found them once the final composition was revealed so dramatically. My grandmother's birthday, perhaps you recall, was June 7th, the same day that the house first truly moved. She was born, though, on June 7th, 1904. If you fail to grasp the significance, my friend, understand that it took me much reading and thought to complete the picture myself. In our Western astrological design, the June birthday made her a Gemini, the twins. Her Chinese astrology for the year 1904 made her a dragon, and to complete the forces which made up this storm, she settled on a little piece of land occupied by a Native American Ochimonitu, a bad spirit. Her home, supplied with the constant love and care which she lavished upon it, became her twin. It was grown together with the spirit in the land, but being part of and attached to my grandmother, its darker part remained comforted by her loving spirit. She raised a powerful family because of it. I don't know whether her death was truly a simple accident, or if a trick of the dark spirit caused it, but the loss of her love and the taste of her blood drew the spirit to life and power. Left alone, the power of her twin turned the darkness of the spirit and became the beast which destroyed what I had known. My friend, you have been so patient with me, and for that I thank you. You don't believe me, I see that in your eyes, but can you offer any comfort, any level of reason to my lengthy story? I have sought it desperately for many years. Mr. Woodson found me, as I have said. He had seen the fire and called for help before coming himself. Firemen and deputy sheriffs were arriving when he got me back to the house, and an ambulance eventually brought me to a hospital. That much I have pieced together. They have told me that the house was simply burned to the ground. They found Uncle Frank's body inside, near the fireplace, and David near the door. David, it seems, died of severe burn trauma before the firemen arrived. My father they found in the heap of burning machinery in the front yard. All of them, they say, were covered in gasoline before they were burned, much like my own arms. I am 67 now, and have been here ever since I recovered from those burns when I was almost 14. For 53 years I have been told that I murdered my uncle, cousin, and father, that I destroyed the home of my family. My friend, I have told them many times the truth, despite its impossibility. None of their minds can encompass the reality of the impossible. I have now told you the same truth. Can you grasp it? Can you understand? Please?